He was the most powerful man on earth, a god in his own eyes, a monster in the eyes of those who suffered beneath his rule. Silk-robed, divine by decree, his word could erase entire bloodlines. And yet, when night fell upon his palace, the Son of Heaven trembled. Not from rebellion, not from guilt, but from the one thing he could never command: death. His alchemists promised eternity, distilled in a vial of shimmering silver. He swallowed it without hesitation, believing he was tasting immortality. But the drink that glittered like the moon was not a gift from the heavens. It was Mercury, and it would rot him from within, mind, body, and soul. This is the story of the emperor who drank poison to escape mortality, and instead found a death so slow, so grotesque, that it turned a god into a ghost. If you love forgotten tales of power, madness, and human tragedy, subscribe and journey with us into the shadows of history. The boy who would one day be called the first emperor of China entered the world not with celebration, but with whispers. His birth, they said, was cursed. A storm had swept across the kingdom that night, black clouds roiling like ink, lightning tearing through the sky as if heaven itself protested his arrival. Even the midwives trembled when they saw the mark across his chest, a pale streak that shimmered like mercury. They named him Ying, son of a noble line. But the boy's destiny was already twisted by politics and blood. His mother, once a concubine, had risen to power through deceit. His father, the king of Qin, ruled a state forever at war. And so the child learned early that survival was not inherited. It was taken. When his father died, Ying was just 13. A puppet in his own palace. Ministers whispered lies into his ears. Generals plotted in the dark. Yet the boy's silence was his greatest weapon. He watched, listened, and when the time came, he struck. By the time he was 21, he had purged his rivals in a river of blood. The boy was gone. Only the ruler remained. In the years that followed, the king of Qin became something more. He crushed the 6 warring states one by one, uniting a fractured land through terror and brilliance. When the final kingdom fell, he declared himself Qin Shi Huangdi, the first emperor of all under heaven. And from that moment, death became his enemy. He had conquered every foe that walked the earth. But when he closed his eyes at night, he saw his father's decaying face. He saw generals dying on battlefields. He saw time, moving like a slow blade toward his own throat. He began to ask questions no mortal could answer. What is a god but a man who refuses to die? What use is an empire if I must leave it behind? His court scholars tried to soothe him with poetry, with philosophy. But the emperor had no patience for riddles. He wanted eternity, not metaphors. He summoned alchemists from distant lands, mystics from the mountains, hermits from the seas, men who claimed to speak with the stars. They came bearing scrolls and silver dust, promising that the essence of heaven could be swallowed. That metal could make flesh divine. To Qin Shi Huang, this was not madness. It was destiny. The Son of Heaven deserved the life of heaven itself. At night, he would walk alone in his gardens, vast fields of stone and silence, carved with dragons and phoenixes. The wind would carry the scent of lacquer and pine. His reflection shimmered in the ponds. But he hated what he saw. The faint lines forming beneath his eyes, the tremor in his hands. In those moments, a deep secret terror hollowed him out. The emperor who ruled millions could command no one to take his place before death. Power meant nothing before decay, and so he began to build. He ordered thousands of laborers to carve his tomb. An empire beneath the earth, complete with rivers of mercury and an army of terracotta soldiers. He called it a palace for eternity. To the world, it was a marvel. To him, it was insurance. But the more he built, the more he feared. The more he sought life, the more it slipped away. The historians say that in those years, he became a ghost haunting his own empire. He rarely appeared in public. He wore heavy veils. His decrees grew colder, his punishments harsher. He demanded offerings to strange gods. He began to speak of the elixir. And one day it arrived, brought by an alchemist whose name would vanish in time, but whose poison would echo through history. a vial of shimmering silver, glowing faintly in the candlelight. The emperor raised it to his lips. "This," he said, "is the taste of heaven." He drank. The alchemist bowed. The court cheered, and somewhere, in the silence of eternity, death smiled. In the dark corridors of the Qin Palace, the air was thick with the scent of incense and deceit. The emperor's obsession had birthed a new kind of power, not of generals or soldiers, but of dream merchants. Men who dealt in eternity, who sold illusions wrapped in gold. They called themselves fangshi, alchemists, sorcerers, seekers of the divine elixir. They came from every corner of the empire, their robes embroidered with stars, their tongues heavy with promises. They spoke of hidden islands where immortals walked barefoot across the sea, of herbs that bloomed only once every 1,000 years, of metals that shimmered with the breath of heaven. The emperor listened. He believed. He had ordered the burning of books, the silencing of scholars, the erasure of philosophies that dared question his divinity. But to these mystics he gave treasures beyond measure, gold, jade, and entire ships, sent to search for the secret of immortality. In the heart of the palace, laboratories bloomed like wounds. Copper cauldrons hissed. Fumes of mercury and sulfur filled the air. The emperor would sit upon his throne of black jade, watching as the fangshi melted minerals into quicksilver. They would pour it into cups of white porcelain, whispering, "This is cinnabar, your majesty, the blood of the earth. Within it lies eternal life." And he would drink. At first he felt nothing but warmth, a strange metallic sweetness on his tongue, a surge of energy through his veins. His eyes shone brighter. His steps grew quicker. He believed the gods had answered. But beneath that illusion, the poison began its silent work. Mercury seeped into his blood, corroding his organs, clouding his mind. The warmth turned to fever. His skin grew pale, then blotched. His hair, once black as ink, began to fall in clumps. Yet he saw these not as signs of decay, but transformation. The flesh must die, he told his ministers, for the divine to be born. His servants whispered of nights when the emperor's screams echoed through the halls, when his body convulsed, when foam gathered at his lips. Yet by morning he would rise, trembling but smiling, proclaiming he had seen visions of celestial beings who promised him eternal reign. It was not just the mercury that consumed him. It was the lie he chose to believe, and the fangshi fed that lie. Every spasm, every hallucination became proof that his body was transcending the mortal coil. They told him the pain was purification, the blood in his mouth, a sign of rebirth. "Your Majesty," one alchemist dared to say, "the gods test their chosen with suffering. You are becoming immortal." And so he drank again, and again, and again. The palace became a temple of death masquerading as divinity. Servants covered their mouths with silk to avoid breathing the fumes. The marble floors were stained with mercury that dripped from the cauldrons like tears of silver. One by one, the alchemists began to vanish, some executed for failure, others fleeing into the mountains, terrified that their own deceit would destroy them. But new ones always came, drawn by the promise of gold or by their own delusions. Outside the palace walls, the people whispered that their emperor no longer walked among men, that his eyes had turned like polished metal, reflecting no soul within, that he had become something neither living nor dead, and perhaps, in a way, he had. The emperor's mind began to fracture. He spoke to shadows. He claimed to see spirits in his chambers. He ordered his guards to execute the invisible. He sent ships across the sea in search of islands that didn't exist. The empire was silent in its terror. And yet, through it all, his court chroniclers continued to write of miracles, of an emperor who defied death, who glowed with divine radiance. The greatest lie in history, carved into bamboo and silk. But the truth could not be buried forever. The more mercury he consumed, the more the illusion cracked. His hands trembled. His teeth loosened. His breath came in ragged bursts. The elixir of life was eating him alive, and still, he demanded more. Because to stop would be to admit the truth, that the Son of Heaven was only a man, terrified of his own ending. The fangshi had promised him eternity, and they delivered it in the cruelest way possible. Not as life unending, but as a death that would not end. By the time the mercury had eaten its way into his veins, the Son of Heaven no longer trusted the earth beneath his feet. The palace that had once glowed with gold and jade now felt like a tomb closing in around him. He could no longer tell which shadows were real, and which were his own creation. They say that power isolates, but in Qin Shi Huang's final years, isolation became a weapon he turned against himself. His court grew silent. His servants vanished into the walls. The emperor's voice echoed through empty corridors, shouting at ghosts only he could see. He stopped sleeping. When his eyes closed, visions of pale spirits filled his dreams. The ancestors of kings past, accusing him, warning him that the heavens were watching. He would wake in a cold sweat, clutching his chest, convinced that death itself had entered his bedchamber. "Bring me more elixir," he would command, his voice shaking. "More cinnabar, more gold. I will not die as they did." The alchemists obeyed, terrified. Each cup they poured brought him closer to madness. His body began to betray him. Trembling hands, cracked lips, eyes rimmed with red. His skin glistened faintly under the torchlight, as if mercury itself was beginning to leak through his pores. Outside, the Empire still knelt before him. Inside, he was unraveling. His paranoia deepened into cruelty. He began to see treason in every face. Ministers who hesitated even for a breath were executed. Entire families vanished overnight. The scholars who had once chronicled his victories were ordered to burn their own work. He decreed that all writings not sanctioned by him should be destroyed, history itself erased and rewritten in his image. The great fire consumed more than words. It consumed the memory of reason. And yet, even in the glow of his madness, his fear of death only grew. He surrounded himself with walls of iron, hidden passages, false tombs. He no longer trusted his own physicians. His palace became a labyrinth, corridors twisting upon themselves, guarded by men who no longer knew what they were guarding. One record, buried deep in later chronicles, tells of a night when a court musician was summoned to play before him. The musician's hands trembled as he touched the strings, and one note faltered. Just one. The emperor's eyes widened. "Do you mock me?" he whispered. The musician fell to his knees. "Never, Majesty," but it was too late. The guards dragged him away. His body was never found. In that silence that followed, Qin Shi Huang began to laugh. A low, hollow sound like iron scraping against stone. He laughed until tears streamed down his face. Then softly he whispered, "They are all waiting to kill me." By now, even the princes of his blood had grown fearful. His sons avoided his gaze. His concubines moved like ghosts through the halls, never speaking above a whisper. And through it all, the emperor's attendants continued to prepare his medicine, the shimmering liquid death he demanded daily. Sometimes, he would drink it and fall into a daze, muttering to unseen figures. Other times, he would collapse, convulsing as servants rushed to catch him. Then, miraculously, he would rise again, wild-eyed, convinced that he had glimpsed the divine. He began to claim that he had walked through death itself, that the gods had tested him and found him worthy, that he had become eternal. But his body told a different story. His tongue grew swollen, his speech slurred. His eyes turned dull, unfocused. He began to forget names, even of those who stood before him every day. He forgot the faces of his own sons. He forgot the names of his wives. And worst of all, he began to forget the meaning of mercy. In the last years of his reign, he ordered the construction of hundreds of secret tunnels beneath the palace, paths that led nowhere, meant only to confuse any assassin who might come for him. His guards began to whisper that the emperor himself was lost in those tunnels, wandering for hours, muttering about spirits and gods, convinced that immortality was close enough to touch. Then one night, he saw it, a silver figure shimmering in the moonlight, standing at the end of the hall. "Who are you?" he demanded. The figure did not move. He approached trembling, his heart pounding, and when he reached out, he found only his own reflection, his face glimmering with mercury sweat, his eyes hollow and unrecognizable. The emperor screamed. That scream echoed through the palace, through the city, through history itself. the cry of a man who had conquered the world, but lost himself entirely. The Son of Heaven had become the prisoner of his own fear, and death, patient and silent, was already waiting. The year was 210 BCE. The great emperor of Qin had left his palace for the last time. He no longer trusted the city that once worshipped him, nor the walls that once echoed with his decrees. Surrounded by an entourage of guards, physicians, and trembling attendants, he set out on a long journey across his empire, searching, still, for immortality. They said he sought the islands of the immortals, far beyond the eastern sea. Others whispered he was simply fleeing his own reflection. Whatever the truth, the emperor's caravan moved like a funeral procession. Carriages heavy with alchemical tools, boxes of divine medicine, and an army of servants forbidden to look him in the eye. Inside his carriage, the air was thick with the stench of mercury and incense. The windows were shrouded. The emperor sat hunched over, his face hidden behind a veil of silk, his fingers trembling as they grasped yet another cup of shimmering poison. Every mile brought him closer to his end. The symptoms had grown impossible to hide. His gums bled constantly. His legs swelled until he could barely walk. He suffered violent tremors that left him gasping for air. Yet even in agony, he refused to believe he was dying. When his physicians begged him to rest, he struck them. When his ministers suggested turning back, he screamed, "I will not die in the same dust as mortals." The man who had once ruled the known world now ruled only over his delusion. They reached the coastal city of Pingyuan, where he ordered new sacrifices to the gods of the sea. Hundreds of prisoners were dragged to the shore, their throats slit as offerings to the divine. The waves turned red, but the heavens remained silent. It was then that a violent storm struck. For 3 days and nights, the winds howled like the voices of the dead. His ships were torn apart. His tents collapsed. When dawn finally broke, the emperor was found sitting among the wreckage, drenched and shivering, clutching a vial to his chest. "This," he whispered, "is my life." He drank the last of it. Days later, his condition worsened. His tongue turned black. His eyes became glassy and vacant. He muttered nonsense to unseen spirits, calling them by the names of long-dead generals and lost alchemists. And then, one morning, as the sun rose over the eastern sea, the Son of Heaven fell silent. He did not rise again. But even in death, the truth was forbidden. His chief ministers, terrified of rebellion, terrified of what would happen if the empire knew the god had died, ordered absolute secrecy. The emperor's body was placed in a carriage sealed with lacquer and herbs. The curtains were drawn tight. To mask the stench of decay, they filled nearby carriages with barrels of rotting fish. The caravan continued on its journey, pretending that the emperor still lived. Decrees were issued in his name. Servants were beaten for showing sorrow. For weeks, they carried a corpse across the empire. In the blistering summer heat, the lacquered coffin began to seep. The mercury within his veins mixed with the blood and fluid of death, creating a stench so thick that soldiers vomited as they marched. Still, the ministers pressed on. They feared not death, but disorder. The empire was too new, too fragile. If the Son of Heaven was gone, everything he had built could crumble overnight. So the lie continued. They carried him all the way back to the capital, Shenyang, where his death was finally announced in whispers, wrapped in ceremony and denial. His body was laid in the tomb he had built years before, a vast underground palace lit by candles that would burn for eternity, guarded by an army of clay. It was said that the rivers of his tomb flowed with liquid mercury, a mirror of the rivers of the earth, his final attempt to recreate heaven beneath the soil. When the tomb was sealed, the workers who had built it were reportedly executed, buried alive within its walls, so that no one would ever reveal its secrets. Above ground, the empire trembled. Below, the emperor slept, his flesh dissolving, his soul perhaps still reaching for the immortality that had destroyed him. The alchemists were gone. The ministers were dead, and the man who had feared death more than anything had become part of the one thing he could not escape, the earth itself. In the darkness of that tomb, surrounded by silent soldiers of clay, the emperor found the eternity he sought, not in life, but in memory. For centuries, the ground above him would remain untouched. His name both revered and cursed, the god had fallen, but his shadow had only begun to spread. Centuries passed. Empires rose and fell. Dynasties burned, rebuilt, and burned again. Yet beneath the soil of Shanxi, the first emperor of China still lay within his palace of silence. The world above forgot his voice, his face, his madness. But the earth remembered. When peasants plowed the fields thousands of years later, their shovels struck something hard. A fragment of clay, carved into the shape of a soldier's hand. Then another, and another, until the ground itself revealed a secret army. Thousands of terracotta warriors, each with a unique face, each standing guard for a god long dead. It was then that the world remembered Qin Shi Huang, the emperor who had sought eternity, and in a cruel twist of fate, had achieved it. But not in the way he wanted. Archaeologists uncovered the vastness of his tomb. Corridors sealed with bronze, chambers glittering with ancient poison, rivers said to flow with mercury. The soil itself still carries traces of the metal. Even after 2 millennia, proof that the emperor's obsession with immortality seeps into the earth to this very day. They say no one dares open the central chamber. Not only because of the mercury, but because of something deeper. A sense that the man who feared death so desperately still lingers there, waiting, watching. Perhaps that is his truest immortality. Not eternal life, but eternal presence. The irony is unbearable. The emperor who burned books to erase the past has become one of history's most unforgettable names. The man who killed to avoid mortality is now remembered only for the way he died. The ruler who demanded to live forever is trapped forever in the soil he once ruled. Historians debate his legacy. Some call him a visionary, the unifier of China, the founder of a nation that still bears the bones of his empire. Others call him a tyrant, a man who crushed millions under his will, whose madness poisoned not just himself, but an entire generation. Both are true. For every wall he built, he left behind a grave. For every reform, a scar. For every triumph, a tragedy. The great wall he began was not only to defend against enemies, but against his own terror, an endless barrier between man and mortality. The same terror that drove him to swallow poison, the same terror that birthed a dynasty of shadows. And yet even in his failure, there is something profoundly human, because who among us has not feared the inevitable? Who has not dreamed in secret of escaping time's grasp? The emperor was not just a tyrant, he was a mirror. He showed us what happens when the fear of death becomes greater than the love of life. The story of Qin Shi Huang is not merely history. It is a warning carved in stone and sealed beneath the earth. Beneath that mound, in the cold silence of his tomb, the air is still heavy with mercury, heavy with his desire, his madness, his unfulfilled dream. Perhaps it glows faintly in the dark, like the elixir he once drank. Perhaps it still whispers in the language of poison. I am not dead. I will never die, but history knows better. It has buried gods before, and it will bury them again. Above his resting place, grass grows. The seasons turn. The rivers run. Real ones, not the metallic imitation beneath. The empire he forged became legend. The man who would not die became a lesson. In the end, he achieved immortality, not through alchemy or the deceit of false gods, but through the very thing he tried to destroy: memory. Every whisper of his name, every retelling of his tragedy, keeps his spirit alive in ways no elixir ever could. He lives now not as a god, but as a story, one that warns and weeps and endures, and perhaps that is the only kind of eternity that ever truly exists.